many people in civil service, they have very good intentions, but it's very important to somehow realize what is the cost of reaching those good intentions. And ideally, that if we believe that we still want to keep achieving those good targets and intentions, then ideally we should be able to do it without additional burden.
Welcome to the Digital Government Podcast. Tune in to discover the future of governance and ways of getting there.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Digital Government Podcast with your usual host, Federico Plantera. I'm a journalist, sociologist, researcher. That today we're going to dive into the topic that affects businesses, governments, and citizens alike, I would say, which is bureaucracy, something that makes people whisper or sigh sometimes, but that instead today we're going to tackle with one of actually eGovernance Academy's latest additions as of the last months of the past year, who is Margus Sarapuu. Margus is a senior expert in the governance and engagement team at eGovernance Academy and is joining us today to exactly talk about how to cope with bureaucracy using digital tools. So, Margus, the welcome to eGovernance Academy, you already received it, and I can only give you then a welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Federico, for having me here as a podcast, but also for a nice warm welcome at IGA.
So, to basically help unpack, let's say, the topic of how to cope with bureaucracy using digital tools, with Margus today, we're going to talk about, first of all, obviously, his extensive experience in designing digital government reforms and also about the 0% bureaucracy initiative that you were actively involved in while at the Ministry of Economics and Communications in Estonia. But at the same time, also about what are the different approaches, not just within the country, but globally, actually, about to in order to make bureaucracy less cumbersome to companies, to organizations, to people, and also to understand what are the different approaches, let's say, to that end. Something that is being talked about quite a lot, let's say, recently, also in the news, like internationally, for example, we've seen how the US government is actually at the moment embarking on this journey, let's say, of cutting bureaucracy, which means many different things. So when we talk about bureaucracy, we're not talking just about documents and applications to submit, but also about the general public administration, let's say, machine and the gears, let's say, that work in it and then make, in the end, interactions with the government happen. But I would say that at this point, we can start from a quite ground level kind of approach, let's say. And I would basically just ask you, why should governments in the first place focus on reducing bureaucracy? I'm asking this because there are many countries in the world where the public sector is quite big, no, in many senses, like in terms of headcount, but also in terms of presence, let's say, in people's lives, in number of interactions that it requires businesses and citizens alike to have with the government. Exactly. So how does excessive bureaucracy affect in general businesses, citizens, and actually also the government itself?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because I think it's wrong to kind of approach this bureaucracy topic only from one angle or from the experience of only one country. I think it's very contextual. So let's say something that is as a wrapping paper around this topic in one country doesn't really attract the same way in different country. And just to perhaps bring an example, like when we take Estonia, and the debate is very much around the topic of cost, like how much does it cost for Estonia to have like civil service and perhaps also to deliver services in a way that is not efficient. So, as a small country, obviously, we cannot have all the resources to afford to have like big government and cumbersome procedures and so on. On the other hand, we are like small economy, and at the same time, we also look at the impact that bureaucracy may have, like negative and positive. And it's difficult for Estonian companies to comply with requirements of bureaucratic system, especially as proportionally we have more small and medium-sized companies who are mostly perhaps suffering the most from bureaucratic structures. For big companies, they have more resources to actually meet the requirements, and sometimes they don't even want to have like less bureaucracy because, let's be honest, some big companies enjoy the situation when barriers to the entering to the market is higher. So in Estonia's kind of context is definitely like cost side, but also how to make the life of our small and medium-sized businesses better. In another country, and if I'm taking now like, for example, US, and I see this debate is very much has kind of ideological component. That is like very, how to say, historically question of like if government is good or bad. But also, when I'm taking like this, what is happening now, it has lots of somehow like ideological footprints. So leaving aside like if something is good or bad, but it's kind of like also looks like destroying a legacy of competing political power is a question in itself, and that's why actually for people sometimes it's they might like kind of the concept of bringing down bureaucracy, but they might not like the motivation behind it, and perhaps they might not like the methods how it's being done without consultation and so on. If you take EU, for example, then actually EU has a long-standing kind of how to say rhetoric to reduce bureaucracy. They have been doing it like for many decades. But the issue is, of course, that while working to reduce bureaucracy, they are at the same time also quite conveniently adding bureaucracy. So, like cutting away the head of snake or hydra, you get like two heads instead. And that's why, let's say, it's not so much like kind of like campaigning on this all the time, but they are like continuously working on this. How successfully, I think this is somehow like a matter of everyone's to judge.
Yeah, because I would say that reducing bureaucracy as a formula is kind of a little bit like a flag, no? That from time to time just gets waved in the name of having to reduce the presence, the scope, the size actually of government itself. But we also have to note exactly that it's not just a matter of headcount, as for example, maybe we have seen, especially like in the news that we've been reading from overseas, let's say, in the past weeks. There has been a lot of talking about how many people are being fired or put on paid leave, and how many agencies are being like shut down or maybe made even kind of like still existing but redundant and like basically not being able to operate in the way that they used to. But then at the same time, we know that bureaucracy means much more than that. It doesn't mean just, for example, how many people work in government or how many public services you've managed to put online at first point of access, but actually all the machine that then takes place and you can see and we can see and that enters into action beyond the moment that a public service provision, let's say, or access is triggered. An example actually could be brought from an OECD report from 2023 that I was checking on the digital transformation of small and medium enterprises, because you just referenced that, and I think that that's an important kind of like economic element, let's say, to take into consideration of the economic geography of, for example, European countries compared to maybe larger countries or even the US, which is exactly the prevalence of small and medium enterprises and how kind of a backbone, let's say, they are also like to the real economy. In Italy, we have this, in journalistic terms, we have this term of the real economy, the real country. So how things go and like how the economy goes, let's say, away from the big actors that you've also mentioned that sometimes do enjoy maybe the fact that there are barriers to entry in the market. And in this OECD report, for example, it emerges that automating business registration or tax filing or compliance reporting through digital government platforms, so platforms of the government itself, can reduce administrative costs for businesses by about 30-40% cumulatively. So it means that digital systems do minimize manual processing, they can improve data accuracy, they can accelerate service delivery. On the specific Estonian context, there has been the Zero Bureaucracy initiative. There have been talks lately exactly about the need to reduce bureaucracy even further. But then, putting this within the European context, there is also another term that we need to put into the picture, which is the real time economy. How can we make sense of all of this, let's say, that is being talked about? So, what are the relations between Zero Bureaucracy, the initiative that you were working on, the real time economy mission, let's say, that is happening both in Estonia and in Europe, and exactly the goal of reducing this administrative burden for businesses?
Yeah, I think you are quite right to kind of say that there are lots of concepts floating around. And for, let's say, normal person who is not following the news all the time, it's difficult to somehow like now understand like how one thing is different from the other. But of course, connection is quite straightforward. Like when I'm thinking back to the times of zero bureaucracies, and one big chunk of activities that was part of this project was steering, reducing the burden of reporting, like reporting requirements what government has in place towards companies. This was referred to as reporting 3.0. And the main idea behind it was exactly the same, that to reduce the amount of data asked from businesses, to share this data like in the back offices. In other words, to implement the concept of once only, where data is asked only once, and then several government institutions can actually get this data from this one place where it has been collected. When now we are talking about like real-time economy, it has kind of like added additional layer to this, because we are not only talking about having structured data, but also standardized data, and data that is being exchanged like machine to machine. So there is no kind of human intermediary who is typing in manually some data into some data fields. And it's happening basically like real time. So it's kind of like systems are changing the data between themselves as this data is created. And this is also a big part of this newly created government advisory council's work, that they see this reducing reporting obligations, and using it by employing the techniques of real-time economy is definitely like this important part of it.
Yeah, for me, it's also interesting that whenever we talk or like governments talk about reducing bureaucracy, we're always talking about task forces, let's say, as if it's a mission. Let's say there is a there is a goal and there is a mission and there is a team working towards that. And actually, in the case of Estonia, the goal is quite bold, because the goal is to reduce these reporting duties by basically 90%, if I'm not wrong, right? And save about an estimated 132 million euros for businesses and about 1.7 million euros for the state over 5 years through this venture, let's say. But then a question that comes almost naturally, talking about numbers and talking about reporting and talking about financials, is actually financial saving and basically money, let's say, the only driving factor of a mission to reduce bureaucracy, or there are also, let's say, other benefits that can come with reducing it?
Yeah, I think like there are kind of like tangible benefits, and it's good that we talk about numbers, because we have to be kind of sure that we are doing the right thing. It's also part of kind of accountability, that if we promise something, or if we invest into something, that actually we can follow up later and ask questions how successful we were, but not kind of like from the viewpoint of punish something, but actually to somehow correct the course and fine tune in order to actually achieve those targets. So, I mean, having a kind of tangible targets is important, of course, but beyond this, I think there are very important to also see the benefits which we cannot see. And I very much believe that, let's say, trust towards the government also is dependent on the good service delivery. And by good service delivery, I mean that service delivery which happens without additional and unnecessary burden. And trust towards the government, again, in a way, is also a very important factor, at least in Estonian context, when people ask why Estonians are so happy or so confident in using digital services, it is because they trust digital services. So those are kind of like benefits which you cannot really count in numbers. Or if you take, for example, transparency, then again, like transparency is very difficult to put the benefits of transparency in numbers, but we all know that transparency creates again like accountability and this environment also for businesses where they can operate better. So there are like benefits which we can count in numbers, and it's good. We should do it, but those numbers are not everything. They are kind of like abstract benefits beyond, which are also very important.
Yeah, I think that there are always, I don't know, I have the feeling that there are some other, let's say, side topics or how to say, second level or like second order effects of the either expansion or reduction of bureaucracy and the public administration in general. I'll bring up just two things, let's say, that come to mind. One that is maybe that is related to the Estonian example, in the sense, I think that many listeners will be maybe a little like surprised to hear that in Estonia we're talking again about, or like still maybe about reducing bureaucracy, while at the same time internationally, Estonia is regarded by many, if not the most, as one of the least bureaucratic countries in the world. In that sense, exactly enabled by digital solutions. And I have to say that from a personal point of view, but also hearing other friends and other people I know from abroad getting increasingly interested actually in to this day. So not just the time of when there was the Tallinn Digital Summit, for example, and the eyes of the press and all governments were on Tallinn, but still to this day, Estonia is regarded as a place where things can be made easier, let's say, for businesses and entrepreneurs. And I still get questions, and that I think has like another kind of effect on people, which is that maybe pushes them to think that something is possible, like in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of realizing ideas, in terms of doing things in the country. And that's definitely one of the positive effects, I think, of reducing bureaucracy at a more cultural and societal level. But at the same time, instead, I would say that in the past, there are some examples when increasing the size of government, let's say, has also been instrumental also to achieving other cultural and social goals, as for example during the 60s and the 70s and the 80s in Italy, the size of the government and of the public sector like increased to a point where, especially in certain areas of the country, governments and its organizations were sort of became the main employers, let's say, of people in the economy and at a societal level. I would definitely say, though, that now we are at a different phase, and we are at a different phase historically and economically speaking, where exactly like businesses and entrepreneurs, like basically also the old countries of Europe, let's say, are at a more mature and advanced stage to actually pursue, let's say, these ventures, and as a consequence demand that the interactions with the government are reduced. I would say that one interesting aspect of this in Estonia is the fact that some building blocks are being leveraged that were already here, let's say, such as, for example, interoperability and data exchange, secure data exchange, but also the once only principle that you have just mentioned. So, what do you think that, in your opinion, we could bring up as the building blocks of cutting red tape and coping with bureaucracy using digital tools based on Estonia's experience, but also based on things that we know, let's say, and that we've heard of, and that we can actually mobilize towards this goal?
Yeah, first let me say that I'm very happy you made a reference back to the old times. I think it's very important to learn from the past. And we have to also remember that actually after building up the welfare state after Second World War, which happened during several decades, there was actually a backlash in 80s and 90s against this overbloated welfare governance style, where, like, as you said, the government was the main employer. And I think this is like a pendulum swinging what we see from time to time. So I think it's a nice example also why this topic is still relevant, because this pendulum is always, you're kind of like trying to find a new like right balance. Uh, like you mentioned, the key building blocks, and actually when we talk about key building blocks in Estonia, and I think let's say we are somehow like beyond this discussion already. And I mean, I don't even like go into repeating things what you have said, like secure data exchange and digital identity and so on. Again, looking from kind of why in Estonia we still talk about cutting bureaucracy. I mean, of course, it has this dimension of like, as I said, being a small country and a small economy, and we have to turn those savings from having reduced burden into economic growth, which potentially and ideally in future will come back with more taxes to provide those services what we need, and so on. But there are like several new layers what are being spoken now more and more. One is data economy. So question is not only about like how to reduce the burden, but actually how to take benefits maximum out of this data what government has. So it's not that the government is benefiting from this data, and of course, like we all know the concept of open data. But let's say there are lots of data what actually government cannot put out into the benefits as open data, because it includes sensitive data like personal data and or commercial secrets and so on. So I think the question for Estonia is that can we really turn this data what we have, and hopefully more and more quality data what we have, into somehow that actually benefits us, and not only providing services on behalf of public institutions, but actually sharing this data with private entities, that they actually can turn this into the private services that actually people also appreciate and need. And second element, when we talk about like what is a big challenge, perhaps as we operate in the big market, and it's an opportunity for Estonian businesses to operate in the big market for the growth, is cross-border data. And for example, if you take like you have a single market where everybody knows what single market is, but that is also concept of digital single market. So how to move data across borders. And if you take, for example, again, this real-time economy, what you mentioned and we spoke about earlier, then there are big chunks of, let's say, business sectors which would benefit hugely when you can actually make this data moving across borders, as well as easily as people now are moving across borders. For example, if you take all transport sector or right or cargo sector, like you have those trucks and the ferries and everything moving from one country to another, but they still need to carry perhaps loads of paper from exiting and entering into the end and like a beginning and end points of their destination. And those are like benefits and lots of work to do actually in regards to kind of really turning this single market and digital single market ideas into the practice. And in this case, the savings, of course, if we take European Union as kind of like one block savings, we are not talking about the millions, we are talking about billions.
We are talking about billions. And Actually, with you mentioning the digital single market and the EU wide perspective, something else that I was thinking of is that when we talk about reducing bureaucracy, even though maybe it is taken, received, or even presented, let's say, as a sort of like a standard flat statement that you can apply from context to context, almost like irrespectively, let's say, like reducing bureaucracy. As I mentioned before, it's a little bit of a flag, let's say, that is waved from time to time. And you also made the example of the pendulum in the sense that yes, it's not just a talking point, but it is actually like a balance that is being struck in a different way from time to time as different needs and as the economy changes, as different needs emerge. And I would say that that's also something that points out at the ways that political will, for example, and political goals or aims differ from area to area of the world, where maybe the topic of reducing bureaucracy is being brought up. We mentioned before in current affairs and current news, let's say, how this topic is being addressed a lot, for example, in the US in a certain way. In Estonia, it's also addressed in a certain way. In the EU, it's addressed in a different way, considering that there is exactly the digital single market. Do you think that we could maybe map out a little bit what are some of the main differences in principle, let's say, when it comes to talking about reducing bureaucracy between these different dimensions, especially right now at the moment where, in any case, there are US and the EU are, let's say, diverging a little bit in terms of paths, not only on foreign policy, but also on many other different things that will affect trade and the economy. And also, basically, where Estonia is placed within the EU in terms of advancing towards the goal of this real time economy.
E-Governance Academy considers and postures itself as a very practical organization, and I would also like to keep this discussion at a very practical level.
Yeah, yeah.
So I would more talk about like a toolbox point of view. Let's say that what are the kind of main ways how you can reduce the burden, and I think they are quite universal from this point of view. Like when you want to reduce burden, you need to look at the regulations. You need to embrace digitalization. You need to embrace cooperation within public institutions, but also between public sector and private sector, and so on, so on. If I would want to generalize, I would somehow like build up this generalization based on the tool what we have, and then every country in a way can play around with this toolbox depending on how they identify the main, let's say, concern at this point of time. Because maybe for them at this point of time, it's kind of like regulatory quality might be like a biggest concern. On the other hand, the other country might want to work on some digitalization issues, and so on, so on. So I think it's kind of like this toolbox would be like most beneficial, and everybody can actually work on their own approaches. On the other hand, I would think that ideally, this fighting bureaucracy, as we kind of fight bureaucracy, ideally it would not be like a campaign from campaign thing, but actually in a way that you somehow create bureaucracy to fight bureaucracy. So you somehow build up a system, and I mean now bureaucracy in a kind of good sense of good point of view. So to build up a system which doesn't produce bureaucracy. So processes in the government are streamlined in a way that if you want to do bureaucratic thing, then this is actually much more difficult than to do non-bureaucratic thing. And I think today it is different. It's much more easier to do bureaucratic things than non-bureaucratic thing. And that's why I think establishing this bureaucracy in a way that actually it fights bureaucracy would be the best option. And then you perhaps don't need this kind of like jumping from one campaign to another campaign in order to work on the bureaucracy for, let's say, 18 months, and then after 5 years, come back to the same topic and fight the bureaucracy again for 18 months. And actually, when you look at the topics and you see that actually we are still talking about deregulation, we still talk about using data, and so on, so on. So this bureaucracy has to be streamlined in a way to create non-bureaucratic results.
Margus, thanks a lot for pointing that out. Very nice observation in this sense, because exactly there are some topics and some themes that we just happen to hear again, let's say from time to time, and not just across the world, but also like across time, so across campaigns, let's say. Tell me.
Yeah, and I was kind of thinking like to follow up this, actually, like also being a civil servant for a long time, I don't really meet very often people whose intention is to create bureaucracy from this kind of like negative point of view, because they always have rather good intentions. So, for example, if we take better policy making and data-driven policy making. So, for example, and also private sector agrees that we should have like data-driven policy making. So, actually, policy is made based on facts. But thing is, of course, that in order to do better policy making and data-driven policy making, you need to collect data. So people who are actually ask data, and this creates a burden, they have actually very positive things in mind. So now the question again is like how to achieve this positive like target to have data-driven policy making without creating additional burden to businesses. It's the same thing with, for example, now when we talk about risk-based enforcement and inspections. To have this kind of discussion, like what are the risks? You need again data. So again, like this normal way of doing this would be like to start collecting data by putting up additional burden, and then you start doing these risk-based inspections. But again, you might create additional burden by actually creating a preconditions for risk-based enforcement and inspections, which should actually reduce the burden. So also like looking for perfection. Like I worked in with the lawyers, and there is always a kind of question like what is quality of regulation, for example. So some people believe that you should leave some space for kind of like to for the life to fill in, that not everything needs to be regulated. And then there are people like saying that this space, what is left for people to decide themselves, is not actually free space, but this is a cap. But do you understand what is the semantic difference? So they say it's a cap, and they see it as something that has to be specified and filled in. And when you kind of have this good intention in mind to go and improve regulation by specifying something, then actually you are going to making regulation which is more kind of rigid and bureaucratic again. Again, like what I want to say with this is that actually many people in civil service, they have very good intentions, but it's very important to somehow realize what is the cost of reaching those good intentions. And ideally, that if we believe that we still want to keep achieving those good targets and intentions, then ideally we should be able to do it without additional burden.
Okay, yes, yes, I understood. So it's not just a matter of points of observations, let's say, towards the issue, but there are like real consequences in terms of like the different approaches with which governments and regulators or deregulators at this point, I would say, approach the topic of cutting red tape, coping with bureaucracy, and looking at bureaucracy, let's say, characterizing it in some way. Margus, please.
I thought also wanted to maybe bring one example. I don't know if you followed. There is like this big debate. What we have is this corporate sustainability reporting, and this is
Hmm.
companies that need to actually report non-financial data as well. And if you go and read the documents actually that have been drafted as impact assessments and everything, Then what is interesting is that actually all this, what is now actually in this public debate, considered to be a lot of bureaucracy. When you go and back and read those documents, then actually people who drafted this regulation and made the impact assessments, they emphasize one of the benefits that actually this new regulation brings is reduction of bureaucracy. So actually they had reducing bureaucracy in mind. But now, in today's context, when regulation is in place and everybody is struggling to meet those obligations, like prevailing narrative is that actually it brought us more bureaucracy. It's very like a good example. And let's say that the benefits are also like a little bit question of like what we believe the benefits are, because let's say when we talk about non-financial information, then we talk about transparency. Let's say if we talk about climate, and let's say investors, they want to invest into companies, they want to understand if this business is operating on a sustainable way from the viewpoint of climate change. So actually, European Union wanted to standardize how data, like this kind of sustainability data, is reported. But this means that actually it creates obligations also for those companies who perhaps don't really care about this. But what is perhaps worse is that if you have this kind of big companies who fall under the under this regulation, then they have like suppliers, like who are contracted by them, like small businesses. And in order for this big company to report this data, they have to ask this data from small companies. So actually, also the regulation doesn't target small companies. They will still feel the effect. And that's again like a very good example in my mind how people who actually designed this regulation, they had actually in mind the very same purpose, reducing burden, but outcome is different.
I think that that's interesting also because as we see the international economy becoming increasingly and increasingly more globalized, especially in the last 20, 30 years in terms of the global value chains, then at the same time we see that we have more and more tools digital tools to ease, let's say, the frictions and the interactions and the links and the points of contact between these nodes that are increasingly more distributed and that also have regulatory burdens to face. So, in this sense, I would conclude this episode by asking you, in terms of digital tools, but also in terms of approaches. We spoke about those in this episode, not just of those in Estonia, but also what happened across time. What are the motivations, let's say, towards reducing bureaucracy or creating more bureaucracy to the end of further reducing bureaucracy, as we see in the case of maybe like over specifying regulation or creating task forces. What are your final thoughts on this? In the sense, the future of bureaucracy in an increasingly digital world is not necessarily one where bureaucracy shrinks, I would say. So, what are instead the digital tools and the approaches that you think could have the highest impact, let's say, in the near future? Are we talking about implementing artificial intelligence further? Are we talking about the regulation? What is this? Let's recap it to wrap up this episode.
I think like at certain moment I'm kind of inclined to believe that good quality data or data management is very important. Like when we talk about exchange of data, like once only principle for business needs, data driven policy making, or we talk about opening up data for businesses that they actually can develop their business, or even if some like bureaucratic obligation is necessary for public health, public security, or for whatever good reason, then actually compliance with this regulation is easier or as easy as possible. So I tend to think that this kind of when we talk about the digitalization point of view, then data governance needs to be in solid standing, and all those technical solutions that actually support it. I think it's also fair to say, like when I'm seeing some like a very good public service opened up again, then we see people somehow in front, like who gets the credit. I think in the background there are many people, like technical people, who are doing, from our point of view, some boring job, standardizing something. But let's say if we talk about real-time economy, these shiny, beautiful things that we enjoy would not be possible without people whom we also have to give credit for doing this job, what we normally consider boring and unnecessary. So capacities is very important part of this picture as well. So if government is able to find those people and hire and give them a motivating job, I think then all the rest will follow.
Margus, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.
And thanks a lot also to all of you listeners who tuned in to this episode talking about coping with bureaucracy using digital tools at the Digital Government Podcast. That's it also from your host for today, Federico. And I await you all at the next one.
This podcast is brought to you by the eGovernance Academy. Tune in next time.